14. At a distance, the Victorian greenhouse looked in good repair. When you came up closer, you could see the rust eating the ironwork and the missing and broken panes. Thick green tropical plants were finding their way out through the gaps, reaching for the warm autumn air. The rain had stopped, but the ground was still damp, soaking through her jeans, making her feel the cold deep in her bones. It was nothing to compare with the cold she had felt in the basement. Justine sat under a trailing length of foliage and watched the sun go down over the red brick house. She had gone back to her encampment and put things in order, packing her bedroll and shelter, burying her campfire. She had set Sammy free and left him behind. He had tried to follow her, and she'd had to throw stones at him until he got the message. She'd abandoned the rest of her belongings. Now she just had the clothes on her back. She was ready. Justine waited for nightfall, watching the house. The doctor had brought a bulky old physician's bag down from the attic. The leather was stiff with age and the bag was difficult to open. Ace watched as he took a wooden tongue depressor from the bag and a blue glass jar. The jar had a handwritten label, the paper yellowed with age, the unreadable inscription scrawled with a fountain pen. The doctor untied a length of string and removed the cloth seal from the jar. He scooped some gunk out with the wooden splint. The jar toppled and fell to the floor. Ace moved quickly and caught it, but the doctor didn't even seem to notice. He was back at the barrel, looking down at the boy. The boy's head was only just submerged in the dark fluid. When the doctor tilted it back, his face broke through the surface. The doctor put a hand under the damp chin and adjusted the position of the boy's head. Then he pinched the boy's nose and squeezed his nostrils shut. The boy's mouth opened like a baby bird's. The doctor put the tongue depressor into the open mouth, feeding the boy the gunk. He stood back beside Ace. They both waited, watching the boy. He suddenly shuddered, neck muscles and shoulders convulsing. The movement threw back his head and exposed the pale skin of his throat, tight over his Adam's apple. Ace thought she could see the flutter of a pulse in the vulnerable patch of flesh. There was something attached to the boy's neck. A cheap jewellery chain sagged around his throat, disappearing into the thick fluid. As the boy moved, something shifted on the chain, floating to the surface. It looked like a leaf under dark pond water. It glittered as it broke surface. It was a metallic-looking dog tag, but so light and thin it had to be some kind of plastic. Ace recognised it as the kind of thing you won on a cheap arcade game, usually the combat simulation variety. The tag floated among the scum on the surface of the liquid. The doctor reached in and lifted it out. He wiped the gel off the plastic, inspected the dog tag for a moment, then handed it to Ace. There was embossed lettering on the silver-coloured plastic. On one side it said ORH+, 1794 Meso/AKG DLT UGN. On the other it said Wheaton, Vincent. Ace, said the doctor, meet Vincent. And, by the way, I'd put on a swimsuit if I were you. Swimsuit? Or go naked. You don't want to get that gel all over your clothes. Why would I get gel on my clothes? It'll be almost inevitable when you help him upstairs. Oh, good. And into the bath. Bath? Hot, but not too hot. The bathtub was massive, sunken into the black-tiled floor. Its wide, curving inner surface was a pale ivory yellow, broken only by the daggers of green mineral deposit under the taps, heritage of 50 years of dripping water. The taps squealed and shook, pipes rattling deep in the old house as Ace turned them on. Don't let him move around before he eats something. What? Ace reduced the thunder of water from the taps. Sorry, said the doctor. I was saying that his blood sugar is extremely low. We'd better feed him before he exerts himself too much. Ace looked at the boy slumped unmoving in the chair. He isn't going anywhere. And by the way, that gel is also a topical anaesthetic. Get yourself under the shower as quickly as you can. Your skin will begin to absorb it if you don't wash it off. Before Ace could reply, the doctor was out of the bathroom and gone. She went back to the boy. Her arms were still shaking with the effort of getting him up the stairs, and her shoulder was beginning to ache again. The boy was sitting in a wicker chair between the sink and the shower unit, naked and pale. He had a towel under him to keep the chair safe from the gunk. The doctor had been right. As usual. Ace's body was thoroughly oiled with the stuff after wrestling the kid up to the bathroom. She was still breathing hard. If he'd simply been a dead weight, it wouldn't have presented much of a problem. She could have carried him, even with her bad shoulder. But part of the time he was completely slack, like his muscles were cut. Then suddenly he'd move, leaning against her and walking, staggering along like a drunk. Helping her out. He'd gone halfway up the stairs like that, a good boy, as if his body remembered staircases and how to climb them. Then, just as suddenly, the motor control had cut out, and she'd had to grab him before he fell and split his skull. He stirred now, slumped in the wicker chair. One hand spasmed, settling into an intricate movement at the wrist, fingers dancing, like a one-handed keyboard player with an imaginary piano. Then one eye opened, a startling blue, and orbited blindly in its socket before the lid drooped closed again. The kid's skin was bright red in bands across the soft meat of his thighs where the wicker chair made contact, as if blood was moving close to the surface. The rest of his body was still the white of fish meat and shining, greased with the barrel gunk. He smelled like Vicks Vapor Rub cut with chicken fat and pesticide. And after the odyssey up the stairs, so did Ace. As the doctor suggested, she'd put on a swimsuit. If she'd been wearing her clothes, they would have been a write-off. Panting in the mirror now, in the bikini with her gleaming skin, she looked like a Filipino girl wrestler between rounds, or something out of an unsavoury woman's prison movie. Ace leaned on the sink, catching her breath, bracing herself with the effort of hauling him into the tub. She remembered what the doctor had said about the gel. Already she could feel, or imagine she could feel, the stuff taking hold. The skin at the base of her neck and along her spine had begun to tingle. Her shoulder was hurting, but now the pain seemed distant, overlaid with a warm rippling. She felt a little sleepy, and waves of slow heat pulsed across her ribcage and the inner surfaces of her arms, where she'd picked up the most gel. The boy in the wicker chair suddenly gulped, opened his eyes and cleared his throat as if he was about to say something. For a moment he stared directly at Ace, blank, bright eyes locked on hers. Then he nodded, spat a fat, wet slug of the preserving gel onto the floor between her feet, closed his eyes and subsided again. Ace sighed and read the name off the boy's dog tag. "Bath time, Vincent." By the time she'd settled him into the tub, sitting propped up at one end, the big bath was about ready to overflow. She wrestled with the taps for a minute and finally wrenched them back to the off position. Hidden pipes shuddered and the flow of water slowed to a dribble, then a steady, irritating dripping. Ace looked at the boy. His eyes were puffy and squeezed shut. He looked authentically asleep. More than that, he looked sightless, blind, born blind like some pale marine creature. She dropped a yellow plastic duck into the water of the bathtub. Not a flicker. The duck bobbed and floated against the pale milky blue skin of the kid's chest as she swept off her swimsuit, thoroughly soaked in the struggle to get Vincent into the tub. The heavy, drenched fabric puddled at her feet. She hooked it with a toe and kicked it across the room. The swimsuit hit the side of the glass shower stall with a loud slap. Ace walked across the wet bathroom tiles and stepped under the shower. When the spray hit her, she soaped her elbows and began to sing. The boy, Vincent remained sitting in the deep, steaming bath, his head nodding slightly with the residual movement of the water. The old faucet dripped, slow beads of water from its mineral-encrusted lip, gathering, hanging, falling into the hot water. Under pale, closed lids, the boy's eyes were rolling. The sound of liquid dripping. Steady dripping. Deep in his dreams, Vincent saw the droplets gather, wait, fall. He heard the dripping sound. Vincent dreamed and listened to the sound. It led him through his dreams. Now the water is dripping from the sponge in his mother's hand. Vincent is 10 years old and he has a fever. Nothing seems quite real. His face and forehead are hot. The water drips from the sponge as his mother wipes it gently across his skin. Noises ring around the house in a strange way. They seem to be part of his fever dreams. They echo, and the echoes make him feel sick. But they aren't part of his dreams. The sounds are real. They're coming from the living room downstairs. The sounds are voices. His father's voice, loud and piercing. His mother's voice, low. Vincent's father shouldn't be here. He said he was going back to university, going to finish his degree this time. He said he'd never come home. Vincent's mother was holding him back. Without them, he could make something of himself. But now he's back, and the voices are unbearable as Vincent walks down the stairs like a sleepwalker into the living room. His father shouting at his mother trying to be rational. Father's voice like something wild let loose in the room, let loose in Vincent's head. His mother's voice like something small trying to escape. Vincent walks into the living room, walking in his fever dream just as his father hits his mother. And then his father sees him and grabs him, shakes him. Suddenly Vincent is dizzy with the fever. And that's when it happens. That's when the bad thing happens. But it must be just part of Vincent's fever dream, because when he wakes up, he is back in his bed, the fever still heavy over him like a damp, sour blanket. There are voices now, but they are low and quiet. He walks down the long wooden hall to the bathroom where the voices are coming from. He sees water. Water dripping from a sponge. His mother is using the sponge to clean the deep cut in his father's head. Now Vincent is standing in the doorway of the bathroom, and his father is looking up at him. Water mixed with blood dripping from his father's chin. His father looking up at him with fear. Water dripping, water flowing. Vincent's memories are flowing like the water. Water running into Mrs. Kielowski's swimming pool as he finishes cleaning it. Vincent is 14 years old now. Sometimes he remembers the fever time and what he did to his father. The impossible thing. Sometimes he even gets the fever feeling, but he represses it, buries it deep, tries to forget about it. Rain is beginning to fall again, here in Mrs. Kielowski's backyard. Drops of it spread ripples in the smooth surface of the swimming pool. The tyres on Vincent's bicycle had sliced through rain puddles on the way home. His new bicycle, the red 10-speed. Its tyres hissed on the wet road surface. The shopping mall was on Windicott Avenue, just across from the ruins of the old municipal library. Vincent always stopped there on his way home from school. It was a small development, just a 7-Eleven, a hairdresser's and 8 or 9 other stores. But one of those stores was Smart Software, and another was a drugstore with a large magazine and paperback section. Vincent got his allowance every week on Friday morning. His mum gave him cash from her wallet before she went to work. "Make it last, okay?" she'd say. Then she'd always smile, and he'd always smile back. They both knew the $20 was unlikely to survive that first trip home from school via Wendicott Avenue. His mother had given up asking Vincent to promise he wouldn't come home that way. It wasn't the money she was worried about, it was the other things. But Vincent was big enough to look after himself now, and his mum was just being panicky. She just got spooked whenever she parked in that mall and looked across at the gutted hulk of the old municipal library so close. Vincent had promised her that he'd never go in there, even though the library wasn't that bad these days. It hadn't been really bad since the riot 2 decades ago, unless you were stupid enough to go in there at night and try sleeping inside or something. They said that Bobby Prescott still went in there sometimes, at night. Smart Software was in a row of stores on the outside edge of the mall, opposite 7-Eleven. Vincent chained his bike up outside and automatically looked at the police posters stuck on the inside of the windows of McRae's drugstore, including the latest Bobby Prescott fax. No matter how boring the police department tried to make the Prescott faxes, they were lucky if one stayed up for more than a day before a high school kid swiped it to put up in his bedroom. Vincent even knew Game Boys who had posters of Prescott up above their consoles. Somewhere in their minds, they must know that if Prescott ever found them in an arcade or on a public access terminal, or just walking home wearing a Sega backpack, he'd go after them. But they still got a kick out of having his face up on their wall, looking down on them as they played their computer games, staring out of an official police wanted fax. Inside Smart Software, it was air-conditioned and smelled of plastic. Some special kind of plastic they used for shrink-wrapping the games. For Vincent, the excitement always began with that smell. It was Friday, and the school was over for the weekend. It was June, and all the teachers were winding down. No, homework. In a couple of weeks there would be 2 whole months of summer vacation. And now he stood in Smart Software, listening to the Brian Eno they always played and smelling that smell. A crowd of older boys stood around the counter, sniggering at the manual for the latest release of MacPet. He casually eavesdropped and heard a couple of names he recognised. Rebecca Cox and Betty Kampinski, girls at school who had a certain reputation. Vincent edged past them. He hunted through the bargain bins at the front of the store. It was all cheap Korean stuff. He didn't find anything. He never did, but it was part of the ritual, delaying the pleasure. Finally, when he couldn't wait any more, he walked to the back of the store and went straight to the top 20 rack and pulled it down. They must have had 100 copies of it. The new Cthulhu-Gate strategy software. Not just a supplement or a new scenario, but a special AI plug-on. You just installed the strategy module in your games folder with all your other Gate software, and the next time you played, it woke up and started working. Vincent had the $20 his mother had given him, plus another $10 which was the remains of last week's allowance, plus money he'd saved by skipping school lunches. The strategy module cost $24.95. The box went into the bag with his school books, and then Vincent went into McRae's for a Pepsi and a bag of munchies. That took care of his remaining $5 and change. It was only after he'd spent his last cent that he saw it. It was on the magazine rack rather than among the comics. Vincent later worked out that this was the reason it was still there. If it had been in its proper place, someone would have found it and bought it weeks ago. But there it was, among the wrestling and weaponry magazines. A copy of Talons #1. Talons was the official Cthulhu-Gate tie-in comic from Caliber. It was written and drawn by the Gilbert sisters, and it was the hottest new comic of the year. Despite an initial print run of 500,000, it had sold out everywhere, literally within minutes. And everybody who was lucky enough to score the comic was holding on to it, waiting for the soaring collectors' prices to level out before they sold. Even Calvin Palmer, with all his parents' money, hadn't been able to pry a copy loose. Vincent didn't have a copy. He didn't know anybody who had a copy. And here it was, red and silver cover shining between Indonesian mercenary and heavy metal. He picked it up. It was in mint condition. The price on the cover was $5.95. In his pocket he had 2 quarters and a nickel. Vincent pedalled home as fast as he could, and as soon as he got home he started knocking on doors. Most of his neighbours had kids of their own and didn't want to pay anybody for yard chores. But Mrs. Kielowski at number 37 was a widow and childless and needed her swimming pool cleaned. 2 hours of sweat and chlorine sting with autumn leaves falling around his head, and Vincent had earned $5. He found another 40 cents down the back of the couch in his mother's rec room. McRae's drugstore closed at 9. Vincent got there at 7:45. The mall was empty. One last car pulling away from the 7-Eleven. Smart Software was closed. The streets were dark, solid autumn darkness promising winter despite the hot winds. Vincent thought he was pedalling his bike as fast as he could, but as he passed the ruins of the old municipal library, he found himself going even faster. The parking lot lights of the building gleamed on poles, casting long shadows of the old iron railings across the road. Vincent shivered as he signalled to turn left into the mall. When he got into McRae's drugstore, the copy of Talon's #1 was gone. He'd hidden the comic behind a stack of gun magazines when no one else would spot it. All the gun magazines were gone. He asked the guy working in the pharmacy section, and he directed Vincent to a woman working on a computer in the stockroom. The woman told him that the gun magazines were out of date. They'd been returned to the distributor. The next issue would be in on Monday, as if Vincent gave a damn about small arms collector. He went back and searched the entire rack, looking behind every magazine, and inside too, opening them up to check whether the comic had somehow got folded inside. It took him an hour. By the time he was finished, the girl at the checkout was clearing her throat and giving him dirty looks. Vincent knew the comic was gone. 2 minutes before the store shut, Vincent gave up. He walked out. His route out of the store took him past the comic rack. He glanced automatically at the rack, and there it was, the red and silver cover. Someone had found it among the magazines and had put it back where it belonged. Vincent just stood staring, unable to move. The girl at the checkout said something sarcastic and looked pointedly at her watch. Vincent jerked out of his paralysis. He paid, taking the money out of his wallet with trembling hands, and put the comic carefully into a plastic bag which he put inside his shirt. He pushed through the door of the drugstore and stepped outside. "Hi, Vincent." Standing beside Vincent's bicycle was Calvin Palmer. If Vincent's mind hadn't been on the comic book, he might have realised that there was something strange about the other boy's voice. Calvin's face was pale in the drugstore neon, but Vincent was excited and he was pleased to see Calvin. "Hey, wait till you see what I found." "Sure, just come around here a second." Before Vincent could reply, the other boy was gone. He followed him around the corner of McRae's to the section of the mall parking lot that was reserved for delivery trucks and employees' vehicles. It was a quiet, enclosed square, surrounded by the rear walls of stores on 3 sides. As Vincent walked into it, he was only 100 metres from the main road, maybe 20 metres from his bicycle. Too far. Calvin was standing there, waiting for him. There were 4 other people there, 3 men and a woman. Vincent didn't recognise the woman or 2 of the men. The 3rd man he knew immediately. Vincent had reached inside his shirt and drawn out the comic. He was holding it, ready to show to Calvin. Now it dropped from his fingers, cover fluttering opened. It lay on the ground, a meaningless flat square of colours. Oil from the asphalt blared into the corner of the cover. Vincent made no move to pick it up. The 3rd man smiled. "You've recognised me, haven't you?" he said. He was coming closer. "I guess you've seen the posters," said Bobby Prescott. The other men and the woman moved around behind Vincent, blocking the only way out. "In case you don't know why I'm up on those posters, it's because of the things I do with kids," said Bobby Prescott. No one was paying any attention to Calvin, and he began to edge away towards the pile of cardboard boxes and garbage cans behind McRae's. Vincent saw Calvin's bicycle parked there, an expensive Raihohin Kaikaku shaft drive model. Calvin was moving towards it. "I don't do those things with all kids, just the ones like the Game Boys or the Crows, you know, the ones who play on computers all night." Bobby Prescott pointed at Vincent. "Like you." Calvin was climbing on the Kaikaku now. and the ones who ride around on bicycles all day. Someone ran past Vincent from behind. The woman. She was on Calvin, pulling him off the bike and throwing him to the ground at Bobby Prescott's feet. "Like your friend," said Bobby Prescott. He knelt down beside Calvin. "We promised your friend that we'd let him go if he found someone else for us. And he found you. But I don't think we'll let him go." Calvin was crawling away from Bobby Prescott, dragging himself towards Vincent. His head was hanging down, and Vincent thought he was crying. But now he looked up, and Vincent saw his face, and he looked too scared to cry. "I'm sorry," said Calvin, crawling towards him. "It's okay," said Vincent. "Before we get started, I'd just like to introduce my friends," said Bobby Prescott. "This is Sally and Elliot and Lyndon." But Vincent wasn't listening to him. Memories were stirring in his mind, like things moving through deep water, things he'd been unable to face, memories he'd buried in wasteland in his mind, then flooded with years of innocent thought like deepening water. He'd hoped to keep the memories buried forever, under old water, under heavy ground. But now they were resurfacing. Vincent was remembering that day when he was 10, and he had the fever. Memories coming up from the depths. The big wooden house on Leonard Crescent, echoing with a little boy's fever dreams. Memories surfacing fast. How he'd come downstairs, following the echoing voices, looking into the living room and seeing his dad hit his mum. Memories and the truth coming into the light. How his dad had looked up and seen him in the doorway and bellowed with rage. How he'd grabbed Vincent, and how the bad thing had happened. Memories coming into the light. Vincent finally able to look at the truth after all these years. How he'd made the bad thing happen. How his dad had grabbed him, and at the moment of the touch he'd done it. His father's one big fist had grabbed the shirt of his pyjamas, pulling the cloth up so Vincent's belly was bare and cold. The other big fist in his hair, pulling it hard. Vincent's mother crying over by the table, the mirror and the razor blade flat on the table, the way they always were when Dad got like this. And at his father's touch, Vincent had struck back. The mirror had come flying off the table, skidding through the air like a hockey puck, slammed full force, smashing into his father's head and cutting it open, laying a big flap of skin bare, and then the blood starting. His father crying out and letting go of him, the mirror falling to the floor and smashing, no longer driven by the force that had moved it. The force from Vincent, from inside his mind. Now Vincent stood in the shadow of the Wendicott Avenue Mall, near enough to hear the traffic on the road, but a world away. On 3 sides, the blank back walls of stores sealed him in. On the 4th side, in back of him, 3 strange grown-ups stood. In front of him stood Bobby Prescott. Vincent's life was about to end, and the shock of it brought the memories up. The truth was breaking surface. Inside him was a power. He could cut and wound with it. It was so big it frightened him. But there was no time to be afraid now. There was no more time for the lies he had told himself, the years of falsified memories. He could reach out with his mind and touch the world. He could fight. On the ground, Calvin moaned with fear. Bobby Prescott stood looking at them, smiling. Vincent smiled back at him. Within himself, he made an acceptance. He turned around. The other 2 men and the woman were closing in. The woman was holding on to Calvin's bicycle. Behind them was the open space of the mall's parking lot. Beyond that, Wendicott Avenue and freedom. Calvin was moaning louder now. "Let's do it," said Bobby Prescott. Vincent reached deep inside his mind and felt the power there, just where he'd always known it would be, waiting to be used. Vincent reached down and scooped the power up. He embraced it, feeling drunk with the immensity of it. It rose up like hot air rushing up from a tropical ocean, rising and stirring into turbulence, the seed of a storm. Vincent let the storm seed spin and whirl in his mind, spinning like a top. Then he let it loose. The storm erupted in his mind like thunder exploding over the prairies. Behind his eyes was lightning and the scream of storm wind. Vincent let it sweep upwards from the deepest pit of his mind, moving forwards, gathering speed. He aimed it straight at the two men and the woman, a storm swelling into something bigger. It swept up behind his eyes with hurricane force. Vincent held his breath, the power transforming, ready to take any shape at all, to perform any act, a ball of pure energy. The bad thing was straining at its leash, ready to happen. But Vincent held on to it, letting the power build, his head snapping back with the effort of restraining the release, the power ready to pour out of him. Bobby Prescott's people were hesitating, as if they sensed something was wrong. Vincent closed his eyes and aimed it straight at them. He clenched his teeth. Now. And he let it go. And nothing happened. Vincent opened his eyes. "What are you waiting for?" said Bobby Prescott, coming up behind Vincent. Vincent heard Calvin dragging himself away from Bobby Prescott. "Let's get started." Calvin made a small crying sound and reached up to touch Vincent, maybe to apologise, maybe just to feel some human contact before he died. The two men and the woman were starting forward. Calvin's hand groped blindly forward and touched Vincent's foot. The touch was like lightning striking. Everybody felt it. The two men gasped. The woman dropped the bicycle. Bobby Prescott said something and stepped back. Calvin closed his eyes, not wanting to watch. He heard the metal scrape of Calvin's bicycle moving across the ground. Then a strange tearing noise. And then the bad thing happened. "First of all, are you sure Bobby Prescott was there? Are you sure it was him?" "Listen, if you're going to start doubting what I'm saying, then we might as well quit now." The drugstore girl fumbled in the pocket of her jacket and took out a packet of Camels, "because you really aren't going to like what comes next." Okay, said the second policeman, glancing at his partner. "Let her tell her story in her own way." "It was definitely Bobby Prescott, right, kid? You saw him?" The drugstore girl looked at Vincent. Vincent nodded. He shifted on the hard metal chair. It wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't meant to be. This was the back room of the drugstore, where they took you if you were caught shoplifting. They sat you down in these chairs and sat themselves down behind the desk and proceeded to frighten you as much as they could before they phoned your parents. Vincent had been in here once before, years ago, for stealing a gaming paperback. Maybe he'd even sat in this chair. The girl who worked at the cash register in McRae's sat beside him now, in the other folding metal seat. The cops were sitting at the desk. "So what happened to him?" said the first cop. "Where did Bobby Prescott go?" "He made it to the fence in back of the mall. He was real quick," said the girl. "He got away. He was the only one who did." She bent forward as she lit her cigarette, and the microphone on the police tape recorder moved on the desk, automatically tracking with her. "I'd prefer it if you didn't smoke," said the first policeman. The girl inhaled a deep lungful of smoke and flashed a look up at him. "You'd what?" The second policeman looked quickly at the first one. Even to Vincent, her voice sounded a little funny. "Listen," said the second cop. "She's doing real good. Let her smoke if she—" But the girl wasn't letting it go. "You'd rather I didn't smoke," she said. She got up from the chair and threw open the office door. The glaring fluorescent light of the drugstore beamed into the dim office. "Look out there! Do you see that?" Immediately beyond the door was the pharmacy section of McRae's. The first team of cops had taken the body bags away, but the wide, splashy stains were still fresh all along the floor. "Okay, smoke," said the first cop, following the girl out of the office. "Bobby Prescott gets away, and then what?" The second cop followed, bringing the tape recorder. He helped Vincent to get up and walk. "And then the thing came after them," said the girl. "Okay, and I guess you're still saying this thing is—" The second cop interrupted quickly. "We'll get on to all that later." "It came after them, walking through here." "Walking?" "Sure. You've seen it. That head. 2 arms and 2 legs." Jesus, said the first cop, grinning and shaking his head. I guess when you work in pharmaceutical retail there must be certain perks, huh? The kid saw it too. Look at him. He's shaking. Hey, listen. Don't make him look at it again. Too late, said the cop. Vincent stared down at the drugstore floor. The bodies were gone, but the thing was still lying there, motionless, at the point where all the long, dark smears converged. It used to be a Ryoin Kaikaku bicycle. Now it looks like a sculpture by Modigliani. You know, one of those metal skeletal statues, said the girl. The zinc fusion-plated diamond frame of the bicycle had been stretched, distorted, and reshaped into a parody of a human being about 2 meters tall. It had long, tubular legs and stalks of metal that passed for arms and a stubby torso. The side-pull caliper brakes looked as though they had been melted and resculpted into delicate 3-toed feet. The dull metal of the ATB-type pedals had fused into a blunt dagger jut of genitals. But the all-terrain tyres were the worst. They were split open and welded onto the ends of the arms to make huge grasping hands, the sprung spokes stretching out like long, sharp fingers. The tips of the spokes were still wet and red. At least, I think I mean Modigliani, said the girl. It looks like one of those stick figure men you draw in that game. What's it called? Said the first cop. Hangman. Personally, it reminds me of a bad episode of Jack Blood, said the second cop. Are you really saying that thing moved? Said the first cop. It didn't just move, said the girl. You saw the bodies. Well, it's not moving now. Was that your bike, kid? Vincent shook his head. Do you know whose it was? The subject is shaking his head, indicating that he doesn't know, said the first cop into the tape recorder. Just let the poor kid go home, right? Thanks for keeping me out of it, said Calvin. He stood on the front porch of his parents' house, half in and half out of the door. For a moment it seemed as if he wasn't going to invite Vincent inside, but then he'd stepped back and held the door open. And thanks for coming around tonight. It was good to hear from you, said Vincent. When you didn't show up at school last week, I started to get worried. I wasn't feeling too well. I'm not surprised after last Friday, said Vincent. Maybe I shouldn't have run away and left you like that. Were the cops okay? Yeah, I would have run away too, if I could. You were just lucky. The girl in the drugstore didn't see you. Nobody saw you. They went into the kitchen, where Calvin stopped to pour Vincent a glass of mineral water from the fridge, then threw into the living room. My folks are out of town for the weekend, said Calvin. I thought I'd have a few friends around. Calvin's living room had a floor plan as big as Vincent's entire house. Sitting on cushions of the floor were Sean, Warren and Guthrie, all members of the Cthulhu Cyber Club. They looked up and nodded as Calvin and Vincent walked through, but they didn't say anything as the two boys went up the staircase to the upper part of the split-level living room. The games room is up here, said Calvin. It was the first time Vincent had been to the house. It was an honour to be invited, something he'd been working towards for years. He wondered why he felt nothing now. The games room had a couple of computers in it, a clamshell Mac and Sun workstation. The Sun's my dad's, said Calvin. He runs his business on it. In the corner was a big screen television to interface for games. On the wood-panelled walls were posters featuring some of the most memorable monsters from the Cthulhu Gate gaming modules. Vincent sipped his mineral water. He recognised the white monkeys on one poster. They were one of the most popular software monstrosities, swarming over eager players in the virtual reality of the gaming zone, dragging you down with damp pink paws and suffocating you. On the shelf over the fireplace there was a limited edition ceramic sculpture of 3 of the monkeys. Vincent estimated that it probably cost as much as his mum earned in a month. Calvin sat down at the Sun, and Vincent expected him to load some exotic software on it, showing off. But all the boy did was check departure times on an airport database. The screen listed flights to Turkey. Calvin scanned them quickly and then logged off. "Come on," he said, leading Vincent out of the games room, down a corridor with doors on either side. "There's someone I want you to meet," said Calvin. He paused at one door, looked at Vincent, and opened it. They stepped into a large bedroom which looked undecorated and sparsely furnished after the rest of the house. A guest room. Sitting on the bed was a girl. "You know Becky?" Vincent knew her from school. She had dirty eyes and a nice laugh, and she read weird European horror novels. Her full name was Rebecca Cox. "Excuse me a second," said Calvin, stepping back out of the room as soon as Vincent was inside. "Hey," said the girl. Vincent turned to look at her, and she smiled at him. Her dark eyes were wide open and luminous, deeply stoned. She had her hand on Vincent's shoulder. Just one hand on his shoulder, touching him lightly. She moved forward and put her mouth on his. As she kissed him, she put one arm around him and pushed him back. Vincent felt something against the back of his legs. She pushed him further back and he fell onto the bed. It was the first time Vincent had kissed a girl. She had her tongue in his mouth now, and he could taste something she had been drinking, something strong and aromatic. Some kind of foreign liquor, maybe. A taste of bitter, crushed herbs. Rebecca Cox broke the kiss and smiled at him. She drew back from him, still smiling. Vincent wanted to reach up and touch her, pull her towards him and kiss her again. But he felt a wonderful drowsy lethargy. Reaching up would be too much effort. The girl patted his shoulder and got up from the bed. He could hear her in the bathroom as he lay there on the bed, savouring the drowsy feeling. He heard water running, then the sound of Rebecca rinsing her mouth and spitting into the sink. The bed seemed to be moving a tiny bit under Vincent, undulating, riding smoothly on big, soft waves. He licked his lips. They felt numb. He tried smiling, and it felt funny, which made him smile even more. Now Calvin was standing looking down at him. Calvin had come back into the room. When had Calvin come back in? "I'm glad you invited me over," said Vincent. When he'd first arrived, he'd felt tense. His mum didn't have the kind of money that Calvin's parents had. He'd felt out of place here. But not now. Now he just felt relaxed. He could explain things to Calvin. He could talk to Calvin about anything at all. "It wasn't me last Friday," said Vincent. Calvin was staring down into his face, looking serious, like he was concentrating, like he was listening hard. "It wasn't me who did those things. I didn't do that stuff to Bobby Prescott's friends." Vincent frowned, trying to explain it. The frown felt funny. The muscles in his face felt tight and warm. "Something like that happened once before when I was a kid. My old man was hitting my mum, and he grabbed me and I did something to him. I did it with my mind. At least, that's what I always thought." Vincent licked his lips. He could still taste Rebecca's kiss, the bitter, herbal taste. "Last Friday at McRae's, I tried to do the thing again. To fight back with my mind. I gave it everything I had, but nothing seemed to happen. I thought I'd got it wrong. Maybe I didn't have the power after all. But then you touched me." His mouth felt very dry now, and that herbal flavour was part of the dryness. "Then the power came through, and it took your bicycle and it made that thing out of it, and the thing went after that woman." Vincent winced. "She was going to kill us and everything, so I guess it was okay. And then it went after those guys. The power made all that happen." He looked up at Calvin, looking for any sign of disgust on the boy's face. But Calvin's expression hadn't changed. "You see, I do have this power, but I'm not actually the source." Vincent licked his lips again. He was licking them raw. His mouth was so dry he'd have to ask for a glass of water in a minute. "It's more like I'm a kind of amplifier, Calvin," he said. Rebecca Cox was coming out of the bathroom now. She walked through the bedroom and out of Vincent's line of vision. "Like when I was a kid. Nothing happened to my dad until he touched me, and then my power came out. But it was his power too, his emotions. like his anger running into me. I channeled it and I amplified it and it came back out stronger. It cut him up with the mirror where he chopped up his blow. They were always arguing about that mirror. The bedroom door closed as Rebecca went out. Vincent stopped talking and looked up to see if Calvin believed him. But Calvin still had the same expression on his face, non-committal, listening. And then, when you touched me, the same thing happened. I took your emotions and amplified them. Those feelings came out of you and into me, and they came out stronger, and they came out sort of, "Oh, I didn't hear you come in." The boys from the living room had come up. They were standing in the doorway of the bedroom now. "Maybe you should all hear this. 3 people got killed at the mall last Friday," said Vincent. 3 of Bobby Prescott's people, but I didn't do it. You might say I helped. What really killed them was Calvin. His fear and anger. I just had the power to make those feelings turn into something real. He looked at the boys standing in the doorway, reluctant to enter the bedroom, but coming in slowly. All that violence came out of him. I could see it. I could see Calvin's feelings and his memories. Then it went through me. Then it came out. It tore up Calvin's bicycle and built a monster out of it. Then it sent the monster after those people and killed them. The other boys joined Calvin and stood beside the bed looking down at Vincent. He felt the strange certainty that something was about to happen. So he spoke faster and faster, wanting to get the explanation out. "But you see, it wasn't my fault, not all of it anyway. That monster came out of Calvin's mind, because that's the way that Calvin thinks. It's the way you guys think. You play those horror games, demons and monsters on your computers. You're into gore software and splaternetics, and maybe you believe in those demons and monsters just a little, so Calvin's fear and anger took that form." The boys moved around either side of the bed, Calvin and Sean to his left, Warren and Guthrie to his right. "There's really nothing to be afraid of. There aren't really any demons or monsters, guys," said Vincent. He said it softly, then he shouted it as loud as he could. It didn't matter. He was only speaking the words in his mind. His numb lips and dry tongue were incapable of speech. Vincent wondered if he had managed to say anything at all. Maybe when Calvin had first come into the bedroom? The boys were reaching down to the bed now and lifting him off it. Vincent didn't struggle, of course. Maybe Vincent had been able to make a few feeble sounds to Calvin, or maybe he'd been completely silent, chattering away without saying a word. The whole conversation had been remarkably realistic, but sometimes hallucinations were like that. Hearing his own voice in his mind was no big deal. Vincent felt a little sorry that he hadn't been able to explain things to Calvin, but it didn't really matter. The boys were carrying him out of the bedroom and down the hall now, 2 on either side of him, carrying him on their shoulders. Vincent couldn't move at all. The drug had paralysed everything, except perhaps his respiratory system. Perhaps that as well. Now that he thought about it, he could feel his breathing slowing down. He wondered if he was about to die. The ceiling of the corridor was close to his face as they carried him. He saw cobwebs in the corners of the ceiling, and he was pleased. His mum would have liked that. Rich people had cobwebs in their houses too. Vincent wondered what the drug was. Its effect was frighteningly pleasant. He felt relaxed and euphoric even now. The boys were carrying him down the stairs to the living room. Rebecca Cox was sitting there on one of the big cushions. She glanced up as the boys carried Vincent past her, but her only expression was one of drowsiness. Vincent wasn't surprised. She must have ingested some of the drug too. She'd probably held the capsule in her mouth and bitten into it just before she kissed him, passing the drug across in her mouth. He wondered if Rebecca had been holding lifelike conversations in her own head. The boys were carrying him through the side door of the house, out into the carport. As they lowered his body, Vincent saw that there was a big sheet of plastic spread across the floor of the carport. Standing at the centre of it was a tall grey barrel. It was the last thing he saw before the drug began to encroach on his field of vision. He lay there on the plastic sheet with the darkness coming in from all sides. But he could still hear the boys talking as they worked on him. "Somebody cut off his underwear. Let Guthrie do that. He's a homo. Shut up, Warren." Sleepily, distantly, Vincent felt his bowels let go. Distant voices ran musically in the darkness. "Gross." "Shut up, Warren. Careful with that gel." A sensation of being lifted, being placed naked into the barrel. The gel inside the barrel closing over his body, over his mouth and nose, over his eyes. It wasn't at all an unpleasant sensation. Then he heard the lid being sealed over the rim of the barrel. It echoed through the liquid that covered his ears. The rim of the barrel had a curving inner lip that collected moisture, and the last thing he heard was the sound of liquid dripping from that lip. Droplets hitting the surface of the gel and transmitting heartbeat sounds through the thick mixture to his ears. A restful sound. The sound of liquid dripping. Steady dripping. Now he was hearing that sound again, irregular splashes of liquid on liquid. Deep in his sleep in the barrel, Vincent heard the droplets gather, wait, fall. Whatever drug they had given him suspended his vital processes in an interesting way. He found that he was still dimly conscious, floating in the gel. It was the sort of fleeting consciousness you have between dreams in deep sleep. And the dreams came too. Some of the dreams were unpleasant, other dreams were comforting and cheerful, like this one. Vincent was dreaming he heard a dripping sound, and that when he opened his eyes he wasn't in the barrel anymore. He was in a bathtub full of warm water, in a big old bathroom with a glass shower stall against the far wall. Someone was in the shower, just a pale shape through the misted glass. The person in the shower was singing. A girl. It was very nice dreaming that he was out of the barrel, dreaming that he was sitting here in the warm water, listening to the girl sing. But he was terribly sleepy. Time to roll over and find deep, restful sleep, leave all the dreams behind forever. Vincent let himself lay back in the warm bathtub, easing his legs further down. He dreamed that his face went under the water. He dreamed pretty bubbles rising up in front of his face, and he dreamed the warm water invading his lungs. When Ace had finished washing the goo off herself, she took the hand shower and aimed it at the floor of the stall. She used the spray to wash it clean. All around her feet there was a thick, clinging layer of the coagulating gel. Ace drove it down the drain with needles of water. Her toes were completely numb, as if they'd frozen standing in the gel that floated in the warm runoff. She hung the shower head back on its fixture and slid the glass door open. The first thing she heard was the front door closing downstairs, a bone-shaking vibration transmitted through the sturdy joists of the house. The second thing she heard was the boy in the bathtub drowning.